y creo que era Brisel.
¿Seré yo,
No,
Briseida?
la que vive en Morristown.
Esa soy yo, esa soy yo.
¿Por qué nada más que puedo ver 3 personas aparte de mí?
Oh.
You gotta click on the arrow at the bottom and you can see more people.
Déjame ver.
Okay, we're going to get started in about 30 seconds.
Okay.
And we're going to mute everybody, and then I'll unmute. I'm just going to do a brief intro. This is being recorded so we can watch it later. Going to add the last week's presentation as soon as I get through some technological issues. The video was too long. So I just want to introduce ourselves. This is a digital Cuba presentation. If you came to last week, Rich did a parish overview. I wanted to do a cemetery overview. We worked to get a lot of cemetery records online, but we wanted to get out of Havana a little bit, so we picked Matanzas. So Matanzas is super interesting. I didn't know I had family there until I went to the cemetery. So Rich is going to do a brief introduction of the history of Matanzas. It's beautiful. And then I'll come in and do the cemetery part. And then if you have questions at the end, we can certainly take some questions to help some of you. I did get some questions in advance, and I put that in my slide presentation. So let me just admit a few more people. And then I'm going to mute all, and then I will unmute Rich. If I can find him. Okay, I think Rich is unmuted. And I think if everyone can see his screen.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so let's get started. So today we are going to talk about Matanzas, and I love to talk about Matanzas because it's where a lot of my family is from. I'm gonna talk about the history. I don't know how brief it is, but I'm gonna try to make it briefer than it is. But I think I have some really good stuff, and I can point you. What I wanna do is give you a brief history. I think it's an interesting history. Everybody can hear me, right? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So I want to give you a history of Matanzas, particularly focusing more on the early part, going into the 19th century. I'm not going to really touch the 20th century too much. And then I want to talk about different resources that you can use to specifically find records and documents about Matanzas. Some of them unfortunately are in Cuba, but at least you will, I can let you know where I have found some very interesting things, and perhaps in the future you can hire, if you can't go to Cuba yourself, maybe you can hire a research to go to some of these places and search for you. So what? Oh, my PowerPoint is not moving. All right, wonderful. So Matanzas was known as Guanima by the Taínos, who were the indigenous group in Cuba before 1500. And I don't know, I mean, we have a lot of people on here. I don't know how much you know about Matanzas, but obviously the name is very interesting and telling in itself. And it was named after a massacre of Spaniards by Taínos in the 1510s. Then Matanzas has another kind of 15 minutes of fame, if you will, in 1628, when a fleet by a Dutch sailor by the name of Peter Hein essentially bottles up the Spanish fleet system that was in Matanzas and loots and raids all of the ships and takes all of its wealth. So at this point, really Matanzas, there's no city there, there's no settlement there. It's really only kind of scattered hamlets around the bay. The Taínos at this point were pretty much exterminated. They had either died of disease or overwork. And so pirates and smuggling becomes kind of the lifestyle in what is this area around Matanzas Bay. And so by 1653, the governor of Cuba is going to see that this is going to be a problem. They, all of the smuggling and these pirates and all of these kind of foreign invaders coming in. So he's going to recommend the fortification and settlement of the harbor in Matanzas as part of a comprehensive plan to defend Havana itself. So it's really kind of more looking out for the defense of Havana. And the following year, in 1654, a French privateer is kind of like a pirate, is going to come in and lay waste to the Pérez Borroto sugar mill. And this is going to leave the area with really no surveillance whatsoever. Pérez Borroto is somebody that I have in my tree. Maybe I know some of you have him in your tree. I haven't gotten back as far as this particular Pérez Borroto from the 1600s. But he was so spooked out that he refused to return to Matanzas until they provided some security. And so in 1682, a royal order is going to command the government in Havana to build a stone fort for Matanzas. So Matanzas is the first city that is actually planned and ordered by the crown in Cuba. All of the others had kind of been a combination of efforts between the royal administration, but also private individuals. And he's going to ask for 30 families from the Canary Islands to come and settle the land as part of a larger migration scheme to attract more Isleño immigration to Cuba. And so the first ship bringing Canary Islanders for the Matanzas project is going to sail from Tenerife to Havana. It does not go to Matanzas. Remember, there's really nothing in Matanzas at this point, except a lot of smuggling. So they sail on the Nuestra Señora de Rosario, San Diego, y San Jose, and it's initially 4 families of 36 people. But throughout the course of the next 9 years, they're going to continue to send over would-be settlers to the point that by 1692, 1693, you have 470 of them, which turns out to be about 73 families that had crossed to Havana. And they're kind of sitting in Havana waiting for instructions to go to Matanzas. And those instructions come in May of 1693. There's a decree from the governor, and he's going to order 30 of those families from the larger group that's in Havana to go to Matanzas. And a lot of them don't actually want to go. They do not want to have to deal with this kind of wild place that they have to suddenly settle. So 14 of them come up with excuses not to go. Anyway, they're able to find the 30 from the larger pool that's in Havana. Remember, there's about 74 families there, and they give them an inducement, which includes a building lot and a caballeria, which is the equivalent of about 33 acres of land. And so with that, Matanzas is formally founded in 1863. And these are the founding families. That's kind of like the first royal order. The management of these families becomes the responsibility of a man by the name of Diego Mendez de León Illada. And the settlement of Matanzas is basically like a semi-militarized operation, because the government wants very, very tight control. They want this to kind of fortify the defenses of Havana. And this gentleman, Diego Mendez, becomes the first of Matanzas as mayor. I have a couple of my ancestors on this list. And then this is kind of like the second group that goes. Miguel Alfonso de Armas is kind of the patriarch of the Alfonso de Armas family, which I know I have, and I know some of you have. Also, Garcia Doramas is in this group as well. This is a cool document because it tells you what when they came over and how many members of their family came over with them and where they came over from. So a scribe by the name of Uribe basically drafts the plans for the new city, including city blocks, and he allots one whole block for the church, which they start to build in 1693. This church, I've been there many, many times. Its baptisms start in 1693. Its deaths start in 1694. Its marriages start in 1693. However, the death books from 1694 to 1817, which are the first 5, are not in the cathedral. Where they are, I don't know. There's rumors that it's at the bishop's, in the bishop's office in Matanzas, but no one really knows. I had also heard that they were very deteriorated and a priest had moved them for safekeeping. But where they are exactly, we're not sure. The third book of baptisms is completely missing, and I think it's been missing for quite a while because it never actually even made it into the indexes. The indexes for Matanzas were made probably close to 100 years ago, and so they didn't even do the indexes for the third book of baptism, so that one is gone. And also the second book of marriages is not located in the church, but I have faith that it is somewhere. I had heard that it was in another church, possibly in La Milagrosa, which is a newer church in the Playa section of Matanzas. And I'm sure a lot of you know, but for those of you who don't, or you may not know what it contains, Vanderbilt University, who is really the only other institution that has digitized parish records, contains a great collection of mostly the books for Pardos y Morenos for 10 parishes in Matanzas province, but they also contain the first book of marriages for whites. So that's a great resource. If you haven't looked into it, it's definitely a great resource. I found many of my family in that book. So a hurricane, as hurricanes do, unfortunately, is going to wipe out most of Matanzas in 1730, and it's going to leave only one building standing. It's a stone dwelling that's owned by a man by the name of Diego Garcia de Amoedo. And so the church is blown away. How the records survived is a miracle. I don't know. I'd love to know that story, how the records survived, because they did indeed survive. But apparently the hurricane was so devastating that it did wipe out the church. And so they moved the church over to this gentleman's house, and it was in his house for about 20 years. The house of Garcia de Amoedo was turned into Matanzas' first supermarket in 1957. So it's a well-known building. And at this time in the 1700s, and what I have found in researching my family from Matanzas is that there were a lot of tobacco farmers. Remember, sugar is not prominent at this time in Cuba. Sugar is going to take off really after the Haitian Revolution in the late 1700s and certainly into the 1800s. Sugar is going to transform Cuba, and it's going to particularly have a big impact on Matanzas. Matanzas is going to become really one of the most prosperous regions in Cuba, and that is going to be due to the fact that sugar is the backbone of the economy. And in fact, Cuba is going to become the world's largest sugar producer. So some of this, what they call the sugarocracy, are going to become some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. But in the 1700s, the economy was mostly like salt mining, hides, and then tobacco. These ganarios are going to bring over the tobacco industry, and that is going to transform the region throughout the 1700s. El Valle Yumuri, which is right there in Matanzas, is very suitable for tobacco. It's also great for sugar and for coffee. And one of these wealthy people that becomes wealthy off of tobacco by the name of Don Juan Jose de Justiz is going to pay for the construction of the new church. Remember, we don't have a church, it's at Diego's house. So the new church, which is, it's still standing, it's the one that's there, which is now a cathedral, is completed in 1750. And it is going to be built to withstand hurricanes. And it certainly does. Matanzas in particular had 3 very strong hurricanes in 1846, in 1870, and in 1926 that the church was able to withstand. Matanceros also religiously celebrated the feast of Corpus Christi, and there are many interesting descriptions of them kind of celebrating this in that church, which is the one that's still there today. It's interesting, in 1778, Matanzas' first homicide is recorded. I don't know why it took them 100 years for a homicide, but nevertheless, it was recorded in 1778, and it was a crime of passion. And then Cuba's first historian and mathematician is going to be born in Matanzas, and he is going to be a man by the name of Antonio Jose Valdez. And as many of you know, Valdez was a last name that was given to foundlings who were basically given up by their parents. And he's going to be raised by a woman by the name of Antonia Maria Junco y Morejon, which was part of that Matanzas elite. Now, in the 1700s, you're going to have Spain's prominence is kind of on the decline, and you have imperial rivalries everywhere, Britain, France, Spain, of course, and the 7 Years' War is going to be really the world's first world war, and it's going to have major repercussions in Cuba, the first of which is going to be that the British are, for the first time, are going to attack and occupy Havana. And this is something, they were really only in there 10 months, but they kind of ended up revolutionizing Cuba in many ways, actually in a lot of positive ways. But when they, and they were really only perfunctorily in Matanzas. They really were more concerned with Havana, so they really didn't bother too much with occupying Matanzas. Nevertheless, the British leave, and the British and the Spanish sign the Treaty of Paris, and the British are going to return Havana to Spain in exchange for Spanish Florida. So what does that mean if you are un Floridiano living in St. Augustine, say? Well, they pretty much all left, all 3,014 of them. And of those, some 84 families, which is about 400 people, are going to hightail it over to the Matanzas region, and they're going to settle on land that is donated by Jerónimo Espinosa Contreras. Contreras is one of Matanzas' main streets is named after him. And these Floridianos are going to settle in about 500 caballerias of land, kind of in the region of Matanzas, and it's going to become known as Ceiba Mocha. And its church, you can see it there on the right, is inaugurated in 1797. The parish church adopted Our Lady of Candelaria as its patron, and in the old days, thousands of people would make the pilgrimage over to La Fiesta de la Mocha on every Candlemas, which is celebrated on February 2nd. So for those of you with roots in Ceiba Mocha, you are in luck, because there actually are some parish records that were not digitized, it wasn't digital at the time, but were filmed by this kind of research group from University of Florida in 1994. And they are available in the University of Florida, of course, in Gainesville, and then also University of Miami at the Cuban Heritage Collection has these records, and these are great. They include baptismal, marriage, and death records. I think if you go to the Cuban Heritage Collection website, they'll have a finding aid there where you can see what books they have. So the late 1700s is what's known as the Age of Revolutions, right? So there's all these revolutions. There's the French Revolution, there's the American Revolution, there's the Haitian Revolution, and this is going to impact Cuba as well. The Haitian Revolution in particular is going to have major implications because Haiti was the world's leading sugar and coffee producer, and now their economy is essentially destroyed. And so Cuba is going to kind of pick up the mantle of that. And there had been some sugar cultivation in Cuba before, but really not on this scale. And so that is going to transform particularly the Matanzas region, to the point where in 1796, there were 18 sugar mills in Matanzas, and by 1827, there are 111. And again, it's prominent sugar elite families, which included the Juncos, the Lemars, the Del Portillos, became very, very wealthy. Bernardo Junco, who's the patriarch of the Junco family, is going to become the alcalde mayor, and he's going to build the Junco Palace, which is still in the Plaza Vigía. It's actually the city's museum. If you're ever there, it is a great museum. I recommend that you visit. And in 1828, Matanzas is going to finally receive its coat of arms, which you can see on the left. And what do you see here on the coat of arms? These are the two main industries of Matanzas. So these are like kind of coffee branches here, and these are sugarcane. So at this time, it was very kind of obvious what was keeping the economy going. The slave population is going to grow exponentially during this time. Of course, sugar requires very labor intensive, so it's going to require a lot of labor. Now is really the time when you're going to see a majority of slaves imported into Cuba. In fact, Matanzas in 1817, 50% of the population in Matanzas were slaves, and by 1841, 63% were slaves. So that's quite substantial. I think the numbers are really a lot less for slaves in other areas of Cuba, particularly in the East. In the East, there weren't as many slaves. Matanzas had the most. And then in a place like Guamacaro, which is kind of outside of Matanzas, but not too far, slaves accounted for 90% of the population. So by the early 1800s, the city itself is growing. Matanzas has three major rivers around it. It's known as the La Ciudad de los Ríos, La Ciudad de los Puentes. And these bridges connected the growing neighborhoods of Matanzas, such as Pueblo Nuevo, which in the early days was not really considered part of the city. It was more like kind of like an outlying barrio. And there was really nothing quaint about it. It wasn't particularly charming. But they did kind of lay down the rail lines in this area, the Sabanilla rail line, which was very important. The railroads, just like they did in the US, transformed Cuba at this time because it connected the whole sugar industry. The sugar industry really took off after railroads. And the church in Pueblo Nuevo opened in 1832. The records for the Pardos y Morenos for that is available on Vanderbilt, the Vanderbilt website. And then you are going to have another new neighborhood, which was designed to be more fancy. They even gave it a name to make it sound fancy. They gave it the name of Versailles, and that was on purpose to make it sound kind of more luxurious. And its church was designed by an Italian architect by the name of, what was his name? I can't remember his name. It's a kind of a fancy Italian sounding name. And he gives this church the name of St. Peter the Apostle in honor of St. Peter's in the Vatican. So there were definitely very high ambitions for this new area of Matanzas. Throughout the 19th century, there's also a major building boom in Havana. They're building all sorts of buildings. There's a lot of money flowing in Matanzas. There's a lot of, the first library is built. The first library in Cuba is built in Matanzas in the 1830s. And so the dead are also going to have their own buildings. And the city's first cemetery, which makes me wonder how they buried people before 1811. If anybody knows or has an idea, I'd love to hear that. But the first cemetery is blessed in 1811. That a major cholera epidemic, the worst Cuba had, was in 1833, and it killed about 4,000 people alone in Matanzas. It's a lot of people for that town. I don't think had, at that time, I don't think its population was very high. So it's going to pretty much render the cemetery insufficient. And so then they opened a second cemetery in 1840 with a capacity for 4,000 people. And that's as a result of the efforts of a man, the vicar of San Carlos parochial church, which is what the name of the church in Matanza City, the first one, the one that is now a cathedral. So he kind of spearheaded this second cemetery, but more cholera epidemics and a lot of people dying, and so that's going to not be enough. So in 1872, they are going to open a third, this time a more state-of-the-art cemetery by the name of San Carlos, which is open in 1872, and it's in a neighborhood of Matanzas known as El Naranjal. And Brian is going to talk to us more about that cemetery. And again, cholera, and there were, certainly other epidemics that kind of sometimes eviscerated populations like yellow fever and typhoid and smallpox. But there were kind of three major cholera epidemics in Matanzas in the 1800s. Now, Matanzas is known as the Athens of Cuba, right? La Atenas de Cuba. Now, that's a high pretension. In the course of 50 years, Matanzas grew so much that it became the third largest city in Cuba, and it also became a major cultural center. Its printing press was introduced in 1813, and that's printing press in Havana had been introduced about 25 years before, but the printing press had not been introduced in a lot of other Latin American countries at this time. So Matanzas was still kind of ahead of the curve. And it's proclaimed the Athens of Cuba in 1860, and it's going to attract a lot of literary figures and intellectuals from Cuba, like Jose Maria Heredia, who's going to move to Matanzas, and Cinquio Vitier. Domingo del Monte, who's another intellectual, is going to live there as well, and he's going to attend these wonderful tertulias and kind of salons that are held in Matanzas, in the home of one of Matanzas' prominent families, which was the Guiteras family. And in that house, he's going to meet and discover, he said, he discovered Jose Jacinto Milanes, which is kind of one of Matanzas' favorite sons. He's considered one of Cuba's greatest poets from the 19th century. And so the city continues to grow. It continues to see massive, unfortunately, its slave population is going to grow until quite late. Slavery is not abolished in Cuba till later than it is in the US. Slavery is abolished. In fact, I think Brazil is actually the last country where slavery is abolished in 1888, but Cuba's right before it, 1886. So Cuba doesn't end slavery until quite late. But its Spanish population continues to grow. And by 1893, you can see kind of a demographic breakdown that I put together on what the main Spanish groups were in Matanzas. The Canary Islands is, of course, represented at number one with 36.5% of the total population. So that's quite a lot. That's like 1/3 of every person in Matanzas was un isleño. That's a lot. Then Asturias comes in at 14.6%, then Galicia, and then Catalonia. But the Catalonians, even though they were the least, were the most influential in Matanzas, and they are responsible for creating a replica of the mountain of Montserrat. If some of you have been to Barcelona, they kind of tried to recreate that mountain of Montserrat. It's a monastery. And they would celebrate all kinds of Catalonian feasts and traditions in Montserrat. Now, I'm not going to talk about it really, but the War of Independence is going to devastate Matanzas in particular. It's a lot of people are going to die as a result of Spanish policy of reconcentración, which essentially meant that a lot of the Spanish general wanted to stamp out the Mambises, and his strategy was to to send all of the rural people that he thought were going to give aid to the Cuban Mambises. He sends them all to fortified towns. And one of those fortified towns was Matanzas. And so Matanzas is going to be one of the cities that is going to see the most death during this reconcentración period, which is from 1896 to 1898. So some more resources that you can look into for kind of going above and beyond just kind of looking at what the deaths, you know, when people were baptized and when they were married. The Biblioteca Provincial de Matanzas contains the most complete collections of Matanzas' newspapers, including La Aurora de Matanzas, which was an amazing newspaper. It kind of changed the face of Cuban journalism in the 19th century. Wonderful newspaper. I'm not sure if some of those are digitized and available online, but I don't think too many of them are, if they are at all. But anyway, this place contains it. They also contain 8 newspapers from the Republican period, including El Imparcial, which is wonderful. And my aim is to go in there and to digitize this newspaper. This one and El Republicano. None of these are digitized. They're not available anywhere. I know that the Biblioteca Nacional de Cuba, which is in Havana, is digitizing a lot of the old newspapers. They're digitizing El Crisol, they're digitizing El Heraldo de Cuba, all of these wonderful old newspapers, but they're not really going into the provinces. So unfortunately, these treasures are falling apart. And what's great about these newspapers is that they say everything. They would print daily the civil registry, who was born, who died, who got married. And as you know, civil registries are the other way to kind of search for your relatives. They only started in 1885 in Cuba, so you can't really, you know, it has to be from 1885 forward. But the civil registries are kind of sometimes very frustrating. I'll just leave it at that to do research in. I think the parishes are a lot easier. And while we have an initiative to digitize it, which I talked about last week, to digitize the parishes in Havana, and I spoke to the Archbishop's office about that, and he gave me his permission to digitize those in kind of what was old Havana province. That does not include Matanzas province. Although there are some Matanzas parishes that have expressed interest in it. And so hopefully I'll have more news on that later. I was supposed to be there in May to kind of digitize one of the parishes in Matanzas, and unfortunately that trip did not happen. So I think we'll be able to also get permission eventually to do all of the ones in Matanzas province, which would be great. These newspapers, in addition to listing the daily civil registry, also include all sorts of interesting things like who wrote bad checks, who was hospitalized, who offended whom, what came in the port, what ships came in, who came in, how many sacks of sugar left, who was detained. This one up here says, fue detenido y conducido a la jefatura el blanco Marco Ojeda Castro, marinero del vivero El Expreso, por el estar acusado por el blanco Juan Medina de something, I can't read it, my eyes can't see. But as you can see, it's very, very precise. It tells you quién amenazó a quién. So this is amenazas. Manifestó José Cartas ya que Juan Cruz lo amenazó de muerte. I mean, this talk about dirty laundry. They printed everything in here. And then they also printed all kinds of joyous events. I was able to find in these newspapers a tribute that they did to my grandmother. So I found the date of, kind of went to the date of her death. And I found the school board. My mother was a teacher in Matanzas, kind of put in a tribute for my grandmother, kind of on my mother's behalf. And I was able to find that. So that was great. So remember, there's all sorts of information that you can find in the press of this era. Another great institution there is the Archivo Histórico Provincial de Matanzas, and I just listed some of the more important fondos that they have there. You'll find a lot of the protocolos notariales de Matanzas there. You'll find the documentation from the provincial governments of the colonia and then during the Republican period. There were all sorts of expedientes. They also have here, so if you had family that came from Matanzas and they went to school there, I went there and I was able to find my mother's expedientes. And I wouldn't have thought of this, but my mother was a teacher and I knew she went to school in Matanzas. And so they had all of her expedientes from the Escuela de Segunda Enseñanza, which is kind of like high school, right? And also she went to the Escuela Normal para Maestros, which is like a teaching school. And these expedientes are so incredibly detailed, and they included pictures of my mother year after pictures I had never seen, she never saw, of her as a child, of her growing up. It's extensively documented what grades she got. Letters that my grandmother wrote trying to get my mother a scholarship was included in these expedientes. So if you have family that grew up here and they went to school there, you could probably find this. You could probably have a researcher go in and search. It's actually very easy to search and perhaps kind of hit the jackpot. And just to kind of go over some of the parishes, I put the parishes in Matanzas province in order that they were founded. Of course, you see Catedral de Matanzas was the first one founded. And then you'll have some like Huamacaro in 1717. That's no longer an active parish. So those records are going to be kept in another parish, in this case, Cárdenas. Some of these, like Sabanilla, unfortunately, the date is so late because they were burned during the War of Independence. A lot of the some of the parishes were burned during the War of Independence. The only one that I know of in Matanzas province is Sabanilla. Unfortunately, I had family there, so that's not great. I think that's really all I have. This is kind of a map of the different parishes in Matanzas province. This is a great Google map that Sergio Medina did. I kind of just did a screenshot, but this kind of tells you where they all are. And then another great place that I've not been to, but it sounds like very interesting. I had family in Colón, the Colón region, and this archive contains what looks to be some great records, like the Registro de la Propiedad. So if you had family in this area and they owned property, Cementerio San Rafael, which I had not heard of, that may be like one of the older cemeteries. We have documentation from the Registro Civil, the Registro Mercantil de Colón, and all of this is located in Colón. So that's all I have, Brian. Does anybody have any questions on anything?
I do have a few questions. It's Denise. Hi.
Hi.
Hi. I was curious. With the if your family or my ancestors, like they had their finca back in the 1800s, is it likely that most of the fincas had slaves?
I'm going to go out on a limb and say yes, unfortunately.
Yeah,
yes.
there's a rumor. Yeah. There's a rumor that, my 3 times great grandfather who had a finca in Vieja Bermeja, like he had a few kids. That was my second question, would be that if there were children, if my had children with their baptisms, if they were baptized, would they be recorded? Would the father be recorded, or would it would just be like father unknown? Like, I don't know if anyone knows the question. It's just kind of, you know.
Yeah. It depends. Sometimes they recorded it as father unknown. Sometimes if the father was willing to acknowledge the child, they would list the father's name. But I think, I'm sorry?
I could speak to that a bit.
Okay.
I've done a lot of research. My family's from Matanzas, from La Ciudad and from Limonad. And I've found many of them in the records from Vanderbilt. I've been looking at them for about 15, 20 years. And typically it's listed as padre desconocido.
Okay.
Very rarely will you see a father in the baptismal record, but they do have a book of reconocimientos.
Okay.
So sometimes, and usually close to the baptism, it would be put in a separate book if the father claimed the child. And it might be because of, slave owner kind of relationship. And sometimes it was other relationships where the parents were not married. And then the father does go and attest that he in fact is the father of the child.
Okay.
And they do have a book of reconocimientos on the, one or two on the Vanderbilt collection.
Great, thank you. Another thing to look out for in the Archivo, I went to the Archivo Nacional in Havana and I found some information there on an ancestor from the 1820s. It was, she was contesting her sister's will. Her sister had died and she was trying to get her sister's estate. And this listed, this documentation was so extensive. It listed all of her property, which included several slaves. It gave the description of every slave, the age, what they looked like, and really pretty much everything else that she had. So I would say it was quite common to have slaves. If you weren't very wealthy, perhaps you had one. Maybe you didn't have any. But I think it was common for most white Cubans or Spaniards living in, or Peninsulares living in Cuba to have slaves, especially during the 19th century, and especially in the Matanzas region.
Rich, you mentioned that the first book of matrimonios of Matanzas is in Vanderbilt.
Yes.
Is it possible that someone can send me that link? Or
yes, I put the link here, but I can send it to you, or I can perhaps post this
in the chat.
Yeah, here it is. Also, Cuban Genealogy Club has transcribed a lot of the indexes from Matanzas, so that's another resource. And they've transcribed from 1693.
But those are the baptisms, not the matrimony.
Right, those are the baptisms from 1693 to 1841.
Is that what the first book is?
The first book of what?
Of Matanzas?
The first book from Matanzas is 1693 to 1719 is the first
Matrimonios?
one. No, baptisms.
Oh.
Yeah.
And the matrimonios, you know what the dates are?
It's around the same time.
Okay.
May I add something about that matrimonials book, because I have looked at it and used it. It's and I understand that it is a typescript. In other words, a transcription from the original.
Right.
Was handwritten. You can see it on Rich's screen there on the right.
Oh yeah, this is it on the right. Yeah.
It's a typescript, so it's very easy to read. That's the good news,
Yeah.
And you can access it through Vanderbilt, and all the marriages are there. They're in chronological order. My family's in there, so it's great that it was brought out for that, because it includes everybody, not just blacks and mulattoes. It's everybody,
Right.
And that's why they included it. But anyway.
And Alfredo, if you have a question with any other indexes, just speak to me offline.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll post this on the chat. Some of the information in the book, in the transcribed book, like there's not a lot of information. In fact, sometimes it doesn't even include the parents. I don't know if that was omitted because they were they couldn't read it or whatnot. So in some cases, there's a lot of information, but in some cases, there's not a whole lot of information. Yes?
Rich, one thing I wanted to mention, since we were talking about the marriage records from the La Catedral, remember I'm trying to remember from the top of my head, I think it's book 2 that's missing in La Catedral, but there are pictures on the microfilms of some of the pages.
Right.
At UM.
Glad you brought that up. Yes.
Yes.
So, yes. So there are, so the second marriage book, which I have a lot of people there, is missing, like Mairelis just said, but some of them are at UM, not all of them.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So UM, wasn't aware until Mairelis told me like a year ago that these were sitting in UM. I knew they were at UF, but I didn't know that they were at UM. So.
I have a question.
Yeah. Alice, I can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, ¿me oyes?
Yes.
Okay. I was always told my father was born in Central de España. Can you speak a little about qué es Central and Centrales and all that stuff? And what does that mean?
Yeah, so Centrales were they were originally called ingenios in the 18th and 19th century. And then they kind of became these big, first ingenios were like sugar mills, but throughout the 19th century, they're industrialized to become these kind of huge sugar industrial complexes that sometimes were like a whole town almost. And so they were then called centrales. And the Central España, along with the Central Tinguaro and some others, were the kind of the real money makers, especially in the Matanzas region. My grandfather was un colono who helped supply cane for Central España. So the towns around there would be like Perico, possibly Colón.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking for somebody around there, Perico, Colón, Martí, those are kind of the towns where they were, or Máximo Gómez, Martí, Perico, Colón, that kind of area.
Mm-hmm.
Guamutas? Guamutas, yes. Guamutas is what they used to call Martí. Yeah. Okay. So Guamutas, those records go back to 1778. But yes, those would be kind of like the four that you would look for. And sometimes, because I had family there, sometimes like my father was one of 10 children, and they would take 3 of them to be baptized in Martí, kind of like all together. And then they would take 2 more, like, years later, and take them to Máximo Gómez. And then they would take 1 over here. I don't know what their logic was, but you might have to kind of look in different parishes.
Okay, gracias.
Uh-huh.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Have you found any fountains of information regarding the plantation, the ingenios, where, the history of who owned them and maybe inventories? I'm particularly interested in Huamacaro. My family was on the Ingenio Victoria, owned by Bernardo Navarro, but I've hit a wall in terms of finding more details.
Okay. There's a great book, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, by Manuel Barcia, known as the 1825 African Slave Revolt, and it's all about the Huamacaro Slave Revolt in 1825.
Oh, that's fantastic. Let me write that down. Tell me again.
Manuel Barcia.
Barcia.
And it's called The Great, I can't remember, African Slave Revolt in Matanzas or something, but it's all about Huamacaro, which again had 90% of its population was enslaved. But there is, UF is great. UF, their Latin American collection, has a lot of information on ingenios. They have a lot of collections they have like the Rionda collection, and they have a lot of information on ingenios. There's also another book called Blazing Cane, which is also kind of but it's more like early 20th century ingenios.
Okay. Great. And by chance, have you heard anything, the name Nenninger, Juan Nenninger, he was supposedly the consul for Sweden and Norway in Havana, but had a plantation in Matanzas, I think in Limonad.
I haven't heard the name. I'm sorry, I didn't, who's speaking?
My name is Aggie Hernandez.
Aggie, okay. Yeah, I haven't, but I can send you something if I find something. Because
Fantastic.
I come across Ingenio stuff all the time. I just can't. But I know the University of Florida has like the most complete collection that I've looked. You might also want to check University of Miami. You can just go on their website, the Cuban Heritage Collection, and it'll kind of list what they have. They also have a lot of information. They also have information on Matanzas, like they have records of the Junta Provincial del Patronato, which is kind of when the slaves were liberated. I don't know exactly what's in them or if they help us with our ancestors, but they have those records there at the University of Miami for Matanzas.
Thank you. Very helpful, very great presentation.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Hi, it's Denise again.
Hi, Denise.
I don't know, something that I became aware of, and maybe most people might know this already, is that so in January I came in my hands a cousin of my grandfather, whatever. He forgot that he had this book that was my like two great grandmothers, where she listed all the baptisms, and I wish I had it a couple of years ago, because then in the book she would say like one child was baptized in Alacranes, one was in Versailles, one was in St. Nicholas, but then a lot of them were baptized at home. How are the home baptisms documented? Do you know?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have a definitive answer for that. It might be that they were simply recorded by the local parish as well, and that they would appear in the books of that parish. I know,
Yes.
one of the reasons for the parish keeping these books was kind of a way to keep control over the town's population.
Right.
So I think even if, it would have to be still be done by a priest. So I would imagine that it would be the parish priest. So it probably is still recorded in the parish book for the local parish.
May I
Yeah.
add something
There's
about that?
churches, like every, same family, but they all went, I found that they're everywhere.
Yeah, just like mine. Yeah, my
Yeah.
father's 10, like 3 were here, 2 were there, 2 were there. It's like it's crazy.
And
Also,
then
for those of you who are looking into Matanzas and you can't find it in Matanzas, remember there's a lot of other parishes nearby. Corral Nuevo is one that's old, 1813. I have found stuff in Corral Nuevo where I didn't expect it. It's a little bit outside of Matanzas, but close enough. And it was a major sugar center. So a lot of people that I thought were in Matanzas were in Corral Nuevo. So again, look at different parishes if you can't find them in Matanzas.
Rich,
Yes,
you just
I was going to add one thing, if you don't mind, that the very early years of Havana, there's a book called Del Monte, Libro del Monte, baptisms, and what it was, a priest would go, all over the countryside and baptize, and those would be recorded in the book. That one was called Monte, and I think that they were required to write this down. So somewhere the records may exist. It's just that it was a priest that would go around and like a mobile unit, and do these baptisms, and then they would go back and record them in whatever closest parish there was. So maybe, like again, you try all the different parishes. Hope springs eternal that they exist. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I've seen baptisms also on a death record, sadly, where the child dies, and before they die, they give him kind of an emergency baptism. But it doesn't appear in the baptismal records. It actually appears in the death records, and it even lists like the godmother and all of that.
wow, interesting. Rich, you mentioned Corral Nuevo.
Uh-huh.
Have you ever heard of Corral Falso?
I have, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
How do I get information on that?
Corral Falso, is that Addis?
Sí, Addis.
Let me look into it. Yeah, it's one of the older parishes, like along with Macurijes and whatnot.
All right.
Corral Falso, yeah, I'm sure I can look into it for you.
We'll message back and forth later.
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned that you had family from Sabanilla, and that's where mine is too. And I found the same thing with records being burned. And so what have you done to go about finding family from there since the records are burned?
Yeah, well, Sabanilla became Juan Gualberto Gomez. That's the name of the town
right
now. What you have to do is, and I haven't found the one I was looking for in Sabanilla, but I did find her death record in Colón. So she died in Colón in 1902, and I'm estimating was born in Sabanilla around 1822. So I found her death record, and then I have to find perhaps other brothers and sisters would be another way that you can look to find your ancestors' parents. If you can't find it there in Sabanilla, look at other brothers and sisters.
Okay, thank you.
This would be before the civil registry, I imagine, that you're looking.
It was my great grandfather, 1893, I think. So it was pretty late, and they couldn't find it.
1893, then the civil registry was open, so it could be that you can find him in the civil registry.
Okay.
I don't think they burned the civil registry.
Okay.
You can check Unión de Reyes too, because some of some of them are recorded in Unión de Reyes. It's a long shot, but you can try.
Yeah, anything after 1885. I'm sorry?
My tatarabuela was actually born there, and I was able to get her birth certificate, but she was born on 1911. So it is possible.
Okay.
Interesting. Hey, Rick, I have a question about Matanzas as you were talking about it.
Uh-huh.
So, well, there's a couple things. So you mentioned Macuriges, and I've seen records from like the first book of Guinness, and they say Jurisdicción de La Habana. So did it used to belong to Havana, or why would it say that?
Which one, Macuriges?
Yes, I've seen that, and that was shocking to me.
Two different ones, two different locations, I believe. There's one in Matanzas and one in La Habana.
Yeah, I think it's two different ones.
Mm-hmm.
They just have the same name? Interesting. Okay. Okay. Well, what's interesting about that is, so I have two different cases. I have one ancestor who appears, I found all the baptismals for her kids in Guinness, and they start having kids in 1779, and they finished 1806. And she consistently would have different places listed in the record. Sometimes it would say, Macuriges, Guida Macuriges, sometimes it would say Havana, but sometimes it would say Guamutas. So I was like, how can this person be all over that place? So that was throwing me off. And along those lines, I have, again, you know, this is people that founded Guinness that got married, or at least there were velados in the Cathedral of Matanzas, and I found it in the book online. But their actual marriage is not there. They have two kids in Matanzas in 1717, 1718, and then they start having kids in Guinness in 1720. But my ancestor, which is you know, it's a female ancestor, she does not appear there. But when I found her death record, it said she was from Macuriges. So I wonder if some of the baptismal records and marriage records are not in the Cathedral of Matanzas, were in Macuriges. Is that church old enough to contain those from the early 1700s?
Yes, the one in Matanzas it's one of the older ones. But unfortunately, I don't have a lot of information on it, but it is one of the older ones along with Huamacaro and Pedro Betancourt. I think Pedro Betancourt is what became Macuriges, is what Macuriges became.
I believe so, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and those records start in 1694, so those are quite old. Have you checked Pedro Betancourt?
Yeah, you know, I have not. I mean, because a lot of stuff I've been doing is just going through the online records that are, you know, the ones that are in the Cuba Gen Club.
Yeah.
And you know, they're awesome, and the Vanderbilt stuff, and that's how I found that marriage but it was weird, kind of frustrating because they have Belion there in 1717, but then the marriage itself, I have no idea where that. So it seems these people, you know, they got married somewhere, had a couple kids in Matanzas, which are the baptism are there, and then somewhere between 1718 and 1720. There's not a lot of time there, 2 years. They're in Buenos, and then from there on, they're just there.
But they moved around. They, you know, I have found, I know I have a lot of friends on this call, Mairelis, everybody who has found our people. They had kids in Guines. They got married in San Jose de las Lajas. They had another kid in Tapaste. Then they went back to Guines. I mean, you know, the towns were, in particular, those towns were very close. And they didn't always have them in the same parish. So you have to, unfortunately, look around.
Yeah.
Yes.
Rich, I wanted to add that there is another book. This is Morales, sorry.
Hey.
There is another book that is called El Azúcar en Matanzas y sus dueños en La Habana. This is what it looks like. Apuntes e iconografía.
Oh, great.
And basically, if you had anyone, so I know that Agatha was mentioning, if you give me the information, if you write it here, I can look it up. But it gives you a brief history of the ingenio, who owned it, and if it was one of the bigger ones, you might even have some historical information on the family and some genealogical.
Do you mind putting that on the chat?
I already did.
Oh, awesome! Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay.
Mireles, where did you get the book?
In Cuba.
Oh.
Oh.
I know that
Richard.
Some people have sold it here, though.
Yes. Yes. Who's that, Ulises?
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, I have not a question. It's actually an answer for Addis.
Great.
She was asking about the Corral Falso.
Yes.
And I was looking at my records here because it sounded familiar to me. And that's where my grandfather was born. And it's Corral Falso is in Pedro Betancourt.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the area. I believe Corral Falso is like a barrio. It's not a pueblo in sí. So that might be an answer for her.
Okay. Thank you, Ulises.
You're welcome.
So it sounds like Corral Falso and Macuriges were very close to each other.
Exactly, and
he became Pedro Betancourt.
Yeah, and he was actually baptized in Macuriges.
Okay.
So you're right. It's in the same vicinity.
Do you know where you got the record from Macuriges? Where that one, did that appear in the Pedro Betancourt church?
Well, I got it from an aunt who used to live in New York, and I visited her, and she gave it to me. That was from her father, which is my grandfather.
Okay.
And she gave it to me, so I don't know exactly. Probably she got it in Cuba, but I don't know exactly. I cannot give you an answer on that. And she passed away already a long time ago.
Richard,
yes.
Can you share any links to Cardenas?
To Cardenas.
Yeah, Cardenas.
Yeah. As far as Cardenas is concerned, I don't know of any digitization that has been done.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly on my list to go and digitize. Okay. And they contain also the Guamacaro records in Cardenas. But I'm not aware of any particular. Yeah?
Hi, Rich. This is Denis.
Hi.
Everyone. So
Hi,
I'm very familiar with Cardenas because it's my hometown and I visit it often. I still have family there and I've been to the church multiple times. I've gotten a number of records from them. There were some efforts from the Cuban Genealogy Club here in Miami through Lourdes. They were provided with a computer and a camera, and there was some work that started there, but I don't really know the status. I've talked to the priest there, and El Párroco hasn't been very helpful. He kind of dropped the ball. So last time I talked to him, he had told me to talk to the lady that was taking the pictures, but she was on maternity leave, so I wasn't able to speak to her. And next time I'm there, I want to try to see if I can find this person and if we can do anything. We don't have anything digitized yet, but we do have a lot of records there. There's some records from Guamacaro. There's stuff from Limonar that's also there in Cardenas. So the records are in great shape. I mean, I hope we can get there. So.
Yay.
Can you be reached on the Cuban genealogy website?
Denis, do you
I
mean
couldn't understand
Denis?
the question. I'm
Or
sorry.
Yeah.
he asked if you can be reached. How can you be reached on the Cuban Genealogy Club website or?
Oh yeah. Well, sure. Yes, but I'll put my email, and you can reach, anybody can reach out to me if you need anything from Cardenas, and next time I'm there, I'm happy to help out.
Okay, John.
Yes.
You know how you can just go to the chat section, and this is gonna post her email.
Yeah, you can
So
just
go
reach
to-
out to me directly. It's fine.
Thank you
And
very much. Thank you.
And if you have any family from Cardenas, we might be connected. Who knows?
Yeah, my grandfather was born there.
Oh, great.
Wonderful. Do we have any other questions?
Hello, hi. My
Hi.
name is Yulimari Garcia. I have two questions about San Miguel de los Baños. My great grandparents, they live and died there. But I don't know which cemetery I should look them for.
I'm not familiar with San Miguel de los Baños.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not, but our aim is to become kind of familiar with all the parishes and cemeteries and kind of have like a master list of what's where, what's kept where, digitize what we can. But if we can't digitize it, at least kind of have like an inventory of what's contained there.
Okay.
Yeah. Does anybody know anything about San Miguel de los Baños? Okay.
Rich, this is
Yes.
Emily Arcia. I have a question. You spoke about the immigration that Matanzas received from Florida. And in one of the Matanza records that I have from the cathedral, it says that one of my ancestors was from Pensacola. And I am wondering if that is current Pensacola or if that is a location in Mexico. Would you happen to know if the immigrants from Matanzas, you know, do you know anything about immigration into Matanzas from a location in Mexico called Pensacola?
I don't, but I know that the Floridianos, not just the people that lived in St. Augustine, but kind of in all of Spanish Florida, emigrated to the Matanzas region. So to me, that sounds like it's Pensacola.
Okay. I actually know something about that, Emily.
Oh, great.
Yes. So yes, there is the actual Pensacola. There was a large movement. Remember that Louisiana was also Spanish territory.
Correct.
So if there is a group on Facebook, it's Canary. I'll get you the names. Yes, I'll get you the names. Spanish colonial Louisiana, and there is Canary Islanders in Louisiana. But Wade Falcon has done extensive work with the area of Pensacola and the research. So this is the Louisiana Isleños Society. They have a lot of information on the Isleños in Pensacola and how they sort of moved and they were connected to the Isleños that came to Louisiana in the 1700s.
Great, thank you very much. It seems like one line of that actually came from Catalonia. Actually came from Altafulla in Catalonia, but I know the other side of it, I don't know. Yeah, we can do that. Thank you.
Great. Any other questions?
Well, Sandor here.
Hey, Sandor.
Wanted to make more of a general public service announcement.
We love those.
Yeah, because I actually put it in the chat, but it's something that I'm finding in Matanzas and Havana everywhere. It's once you hit the early 1700s, and I think there was somebody who wrote a 50-page essay about that. The standard way where your first last name comes from your dad and second last name comes from the first last name of your mom, it's kind of lost, and they like jump around whichever last names they use. So in my case, the people who went from Matanzas, at least their velación appears there, and went to Guinness. The lady appears as Bernardina de Cuellar in Matanzas in both of the baptismal records, but in Guinness she appears as Bernardina Vasquez. So that can be an issue if you're trying to, you know, just look by last names, because it's possible that she had both last names, and then in some records she appears with one and in other records with the other. I don't know why it was done that way, but I also have, in Guanabacoa, I have another line that where it was a male Galician person marrying a Cuban lady. She appears as Rodriguez Pacheco, but it turns out that in the baptismal record of the youngest son that they had, he appears as Rodriguez Manso. You know that last name, the famous Manso last name. And then I couldn't find her death record in Guanabacoa, and it's because in her death record, she doesn't have Rodriguez. She says Maria Mansa. So it's another layer of sort of headaches to deal with, but
Well,
yeah.
something to be aware. Certainly, yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up. I find that a lot as well, where the one last name will be there, and sometimes it'll be the mother's last name, and it's very confusing. But in a way, it's good because it gives us hope that we can find that relative that we can't find. So
the only way to circumvent that, I said, is I used to just try to look for my own ancestors when I would go to church. Now I try to look for every single sibling, because sometimes every single baptismal record can give you a new set of information that you didn't know. So like with the one in Guanabacoa, like the first 5 didn't have the Manso, and then the last one had it, and then that's how I was able to piece that together.
Oh yeah, I always look for siblings. I think that's a great strategy, because you're able to find all kinds of information about their parents who are, you know, your direct ancestors. So I recommend always looking for siblings as well.
Rich, Emily Arcia again. Are there any sources for information on the people who died during the Reconcentración? Would they just be recorded in the regular parishes, or has anybody gone and made any kind of list from that?
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up, because I can certainly speak to that. I wrote a journal article on the Reconcentración that hopefully I can have published by the fall. Reconcentración, it's not known how many people died, but it's estimated that perhaps 300,000 to 400,000 Cubans died throughout the course of like 2 years. There have been different works, different books that have been written on it, but not a whole lot. The best one that I have found, although it doesn't give you names, is one called War and Genocide, and it's by John Lawrence Tome. There's also another great one called Herida Profunda, which is from Cuba, but it doesn't list names. However, this one here, if you can see it, this one gives you a lot of statistics. It's called La Reconcentración by Raúl Izquierdo Canosa, and this gives you perhaps like the most detailed statistics that I have seen, but again, not super specific like what we're looking for. I started to kind of make my own list when I was doing research for this article, and I digitized like kind of several books of deaths during the Reconcentración period. So I started to compile that, but it's a lot of deaths. It's a lot of people that died, and no one has kind of, there's no master list on who died. I mean, it's not even known exactly how many people died. There's all kinds of different estimates. Is there an area you're looking in particular with the Reconcentración?
Well, my grandmother was orphaned, relatively young. I don't know exactly how old she was. She was either a girl or a teenager. And I am just wondering if her father should have been fairly young. And I just wonder if perhaps that was the result of the La Reconcentración.
Yeah. Do you know what year?
I don't know when he died. I mean, I don't know how old she was. I mean, I know that she ended up being in an orphanage because her elder sister married, and she ended being actually, I don't know if it's an orphanage, but like a nuns, un convento.
Right.
But I don't know how old she was.
Yeah, the Reconcentración started in late 1896, and it doesn't end until 1898. And still in 1899, people were still dying from all of these diseases. And unfortunately, a lot of times people were just kind of buried in mass graves, and I don't know if those were recorded.
Hey, Rick Sander again.
Yes.
I have a question. So you've obviously been to Cuba far more than I have, but I've been looking at some books. I've looked at plenty of books where I'm starting to see a pattern, and I wonder if you've seen it too. In late 1600s, early 1700s, I have at least 3 different lines are from Galicia, from La Coruña. Do you have you seen anything that shows that there's some sort of migration from there? Because you're also seeing a lot of, especially in Guanajuato, a lot of people from the Canary Islands, and I've seen that. But from Galicia, I was not expecting that, and I was kind of shocked. I have like 3 different lines: the Basayo line, Praga, which that's fairly Galician, and also Lausanne, which I think a lot of other those words to witness to. I found them through mine went through Jesus del Monte, Bejucal, and then Bejucal, San Jose.
And Calvario has Lausanne too.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. I think that there was an early wave of Galician migration to Cuba. Of course, the major wave of Galician immigration was in the early 20th century, really kind of late 19th into the 20th century. By 1935, it kind of stops. But there was a very early wave, but I haven't seen anything. I have no relatives from Galicia that early. So I haven't, nor have I seen really any in books from Galicia from late 1600s or early 1700s. But there was a wave, an earlier wave.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions before we go to Brian?
Nope. Waiting for Brian.
Wonderful.
Okay. I'll make mine kind of quick because we don't have much time left. I will.
Oh, let me stop sharing my screen.
We can always extend, Brian. None of us have to go home.
Oh, okay, that's awesome.
We got nothing to do here, man. We are on the quarantine.
Oh.
And we got protesters outside, so.
Yeah, we have that here too. So, first of all, I just want to thank everyone that donated to our last presentation. We are officially a 501c3, and Rich and I, and hopefully Eileen and some other people, will go down and continue digitizing these records. So I just wanted to thank those people that had contributed to us. So we really appreciate that. So I'm going to talk really quickly about Cuban cemeteries. I'll show you what we've digitized and try and tie it into Matanzas as much as possible. If you will let me know at the end if there are any other topics that we can discuss in some future presentations. So everyone can hear me okay? If there's a problem, just put the message in the chat. So Rich talked about I thought Rich froze. So Rich talked about the history of Matanzas, and he told us about that state of the art cemetery. That's San Carlos Borromeo. It's state of the art because it's the only functioning catacombs in Cuba. There is an underground gallery and some other underground functions at Colón Cemetery in Havana, but Matanzas is a very special place. If I have time, I'll show you how to list your ancestor on Find a Grave. That's where, if you list your ancestor there, that's the website where I go and the team will go if we're looking for your specific ancestor. And anytime we're doing a parish project, I will try to make sure I can get over to that cemetery to make sure we can get that digitized. So you can't really separate the cemetery records from the church influence in Cuba. A bautismo usually happens within 2 weeks of birth. Those serve as they serve as the official birth record before the Registro Civil. For the Asian workers, they were often baptized upon arrival. Then we had the godparents, which were also which was a component that strengthened that family unit. The 3 records we look at is the bautismo, matrimonios, and defunción. So I'm kind of focusing on the last part, kind of the saddest part of life, but those records are very important. And I just want to note that the priests rarely went to the cemetery. They did sometimes go to the cemetery, but all that was done at the parish. So Espada Cemetery, which was probably one of the biggest and most important cemeteries in Cuba, in Havana, was consecrated in 1806. I made this little timeline so we can keep Matanzas in kind of in perspective. I found a lot of really interesting stories surrounding the church and keeping Protestants out and, keeping Bibles out. Cuba was not the only country that ever did this. The United States did this. Other countries have done this. But I found some of these interesting little pieces because I always wondered why my Cuban family didn't have a Bible. That was more of a Protestant tradition and it was less of a Catholic tradition. So I have my dates confused there. So 1811, the Matanza Cemetery was consecrated. That was before San Carlos Borromeo, and then Santiago was consecrated. So Santiago is the second most important, from a patrimonial perspective, the second most important cemetery in Cuba. The first being Necropolis Colón, and then then the Borromeo in Matanzas. I would like to do maybe a separate presentation to go over all the legal issues around burials in Cuba. It had a lot of controversy because it was expensive. People couldn't afford it. There were times when there were common graves in Cuba that there weren't any cemeteries. There were times when people were buried in the churchyard. As you could tell, the church would obviously get too crowded, so it wouldn't be able to bury everyone in the church forever. There were also diseases that affected, there were cholera breakouts that also, with all those extra deaths, it put a strain on the cemetery system. So I just want to put some of these laws in here just to show legally what was being done. And then I'll show you a story that I found about one of my ancestors that was involved in one of these situations that caused some controversy. So the 1860s, Espada reaches its capacity, so it closes down. You'll see this happen in Cuba a lot, where there's a cemetery established, it gets too full. Espada was completely erased. There's just a little portion of that cemetery left. If you want to find any records for Espada, you can find that on Cuba Gen Club website. Here you'll see in 1867 a regulation ending common graves that made the cemeteries even more important. And in 1872, the Havana Cemetery opens as we know it. So I just want to say briefly, just kind of a 101. If you're trying to read a gravestone, you'll see a star or a cross, and that just differentiates between a birth and their death date. You have to be careful with the month, day, year. I've seen it go month, day, year, and day, month, year. It could be just influence of other influences from international people. So even if you're in Find a Grave, you should be careful that you may think it's May 10th, but it could be October 5th. But usually the year is always right, but sometimes there's going to be a little bit of confusion. And after I've uploaded 1,000 records, I get a little bit cross-eyed. I have to pay attention to those records. If you see anything on Find a Grave, please let us know. But that's just something to keep in mind. If you see someone with the year is correct, but the day and the month could be off, that still could be your ancestor. So the Cuban system, probably have to come back and readdress this in kind of a longer format. In Havana, they have Campo Común. That's where one of my ancestors were buried. So it was a common grave. There's no, it was my aunt. She was only 20 days old. People that couldn't afford to have, to pay to have for land at the cemetery, they had to go into these Campo Común. So my ancestor, she was part of that. I did see that in the record. There's no place for me to go visit her or visit that area. So I'll get back to that story in a later slide. Then you have to keep in mind, in North American terms, we don't have the same system that they have in Cuba. They have the ossuary system. So you'll see the big cemetery plot. You'll see a 5 or 6 foot area. Then at the top of it, you'll see a smaller, maybe 1 or 2 foot square area. Usually the body is put in the larger section for 2 years, and then those remains are moved into the ossuary, and that allows the family to have that one plot, and you just kind of, it's a little bit of a stacked system. So I've never really heard about that in the U.S., so that was something I had to kind of get used to. In the nichos, they don't remove those remains. It's only in those that have the ossuary. This is very, this system, having these plots, you're going to have 2 ways to find your ancestors in a Cuban cemetery. You're going to have the death record, and then you're going to have the cards for the plot owner of those plots. So you have to keep those 2 in mind. People have asked me, we have a story coming up. You see one last name on a gravestone, there could be anywhere from 2 to dozens of people located in that one plot. You have to be careful with some of these last names. They get shortened. You'll see in that photo, there is a FDZ. When I first went to the Havana Cemetery, I was like, well, who are these Glez people? So it's Fernandez, Gonzalez, Hernandez, Rodriguez. So you have to be careful with, you're probably saving space and saving money by letter by having those last names shortened. This one, I believe, is from Matanzas, this photo. So you're going to have 3 dates with an ancestor. You're going to have their actual death date, their burial date, and that relocation date, which could be plus or minus 24 months after the burial date. There's a lot of symbols to pay attention to. Some of these symbols I encountered when I did my own family research. You'll see these, and you have to be careful because I was told, you'll see that the middle image with the IOOF. I was told that my female ancestor was probably part of the Rebeccas. The Rebeccas are part of, are part of the Oddfellows. They are not part of the Freemasons. The Freemasons are pretty much male-dominated group. So it would be unlikely that you'd have a woman buried in a Freemason cemetery or attached to the Freemasons. But you never know. I say never say never. Then you'll see on the right, you'll see that Masonic at the top of America. You'll see that Masonic symbol as well. You'll see this on many tombstones, clausurada. That means that's closed. That the kitchen is closed. They're not accepting any more people to be placed inside that. Could be the end of the family line, or the family want to plot somewhere else. It's closed. So I want to talk briefly about burial, the tensions around, you think that a cemetery would be a peaceful place. It was often lots of controversies. There were, Cuba being a Catholic country, we didn't want, they didn't want non-Christians buried in the cemetery. Protestants, heretics, which a Freemason could qualify as a heretic, suicides, public sinners, and the unbaptized. So this kind of changed around the 1900s when we got away from some of these social norms. Rich had talked about this town outside of Matanzas. So I have an ancestor there. He had a slave who had a daughter, and the daughter was not baptized, so she was not allowed to be buried inside the Catholic Church. So Nicholas Bello took the body and buried her a few feet outside of the cemetery. So I guess hoping that, being in near the perimeter of that the holy ground, that would be an ideal resting place for her. So I found that out a couple of months ago. I just wanted to share that story. So this is my ancestor that was buried in one plot. She was moved to another plot way after that 2-year mark. So what happens with these plot ownerships, someone else could buy it. So a friend of the family went over, this is my grandmother's oldest sister, took her from the family plot and moved her into the Oddfellow plot, which they thought maybe this ancestor was a Rebecca, but I think she had a friend that was a friend of a friend that was an Oddfellow. And then I told you about the 20-year-old aunt that I had. So I go, whenever I visit the Havana Cemetery, I go to Villa, my aunt. I go to her grave and I ask her to take care of my aunt, who's just barely 3 weeks old. So that's a really important ritual for me. So here's where my aunt is now located. So you see the word lodge, which makes you think it could be Freemason, but this is the Odd Fellows, the IOOF. And you'll see here in the corner the Rebecca degrees. So an IOOF could be a Rebecca, but not a Freemason. A Freemason would not refer to a woman as a Rebecca. And that's a whole other interesting story that we could get into. I came across some really interesting stories about my ancestor from the Canary Islands. You would have a male married to a woman in the Canary Islands. This story is about Pitango, which I think is a funny name. He left his wife in the Canary Islands, moved to Cuba, had a second wife and a new family, and it created this mythology of these lonely women in the Canary Islands coming to terrorize the children of Cuba because they had lost their spouse. So I just want to put in March and December, there was a certain period where marriages were cheaper. So you'll see a lot of marriages in the months of March and December because that wasn't a typical time when it was the lowest. It was like supply and demand. There weren't a lot of weddings being planned then. So the church came in and said, we're going to reduce the rates or make it free for people to get married in March and December. There were a lot of cases, especially at El Campo, where people weren't getting married and the church wasn't happy about that. Let me see if I can. So this is what we've done so far. You'll see on the right is our preliminary, our wish list. These are Havana province cemeteries. And you'll see on the left, you'll see what we've digitized so far. Now in Havana, we've got 3,000 plus. If there's 1 million people there, that we haven't even got 10% of that yet. So I want to get 10% before I die. So that's my personal goal, is to get 100,000 records added for Cologne. In Cardenas, someone mentioned earlier, I went to Cardenas for about 30 minutes. The taxi was waiting. He wouldn't wait any longer. So I took as many photos as I could. I want to get back to that cemetery. I didn't get a chance to look at the records that they have, but I did upload 65 records for that cemetery. Matanzas, we have over 2,000 photos for that cemetery. I know there's people requesting more records for that. If you go on Find a Grave, that request will stay on there longer, or you could also email me as well. Cienfuegos, we have 240. Bejucal, thank you, Eileen. We just surpassed 1,000 records for that cemetery. And all these records means we have a picture. So we have a legible photo, and I would say 98% of those have a death date on there. La Salud, we also have 283. So before this, you can see on the right, we didn't have many cemetery records available to us. Find a Grave does feed into Ancestry.com if you have your family tree on Ancestry. So this is our task list. I personally would like to get to Pinar del Rio to look at those cemeteries. I have family out there, and it seems to be like the Wild West, where it's hard to get information. It's hard to get parish information. It's hard to get cemetery information. I just recently found a paper about these 42, 56, and 32. These are active cemeteries in those provinces. And that report was published last year by a university student in Santa Clara. If anybody would like to see that report, it's super interesting. It shows you some of the symbols and some of the conditions of those cemeteries. I have relatives in Placetas, which is mentioned in that report. So our heritage is disappearing. These tombstones don't last very long. They're in the Cuban sun and the Cuban heat, and it's just, over time these gravestones become brittle and they're disappearing. So there's really an urgency, and it's the same with the books. Rich and I and Eileen and everyone in Digital Cuba, we have this kind of urgency, like it's something we can't wait. It's something that has to be done as soon as possible. So we're going to be developing action plans. We're going to be prioritizing the locations. We need people to help us with the transcribing and digitizing. That part takes so long, those transcribing and digitizing, because you really want to look at those records to make sure that they're accurate. Then my dream is to start an obituary project, but that will be later in the future. So now to Matanza. So it was founded in 1871, which We heard about that in Rich's presentation. It's the third most important cemetery from the patrimonial system. Has the catacombs, which I'll show you a picture of that. And I would love to get permission to go down there and photograph those records as well. So you can see those records for free, 2,153 for free on Find a Grave. That's them restoring underground. And by restoring, I hope that doesn't mean that they've removed, it looks to me like the tombs have been removed. I still see some of the names in some of those nichos. So I spent 2 days in Matanzas at the cemeteries, about 5 to 6 hours each. If super hot there, you had to make sure I didn't get dehydrated. I took about 2,000 photos. It took me about 14 hours to just transcribe those because I have to download those, read the names, make sure I get everybody in every family group. Now, take note that photos on Find a Grave are not as high quality as the photos that I took. So if there's something that you want a better quality photo of, you just would have to email me and I can get you a higher res photo. They get compressed when you upload them on Find a Grave.
Just to piggyback off of what Brian said, I know a lot of you were on last week's call, some of you weren't. I think we're trying to post that onto the Facebook page. It'll kind of let you know what's being done with the parish records. Again, we have permission to digitize what's in Havana, the Diocese of Havana, and I want to get down there as soon as possible and digitize perhaps San Miguel de Padrón, Jaruco, Alacranes, some others. So that's very exciting. We do need volunteers to transcribe. If you want to donate, that's fine. We could certainly use the money. It's very expensive, especially to travel from church to church over there. And we'd like to buy each church to buy them a laptop so that they're able to view the records as well. Most of the churches don't have computers. So we want to thank you for joining us today. Hopefully we'll do kind of something similar. Perhaps we'll do another region of Cuba next time.
Brian is back.
Oh, Brian's back. Wonderful.
Did you see anything of my presentation?
Yes, everything.
Yeah,
okay.
We saw it all.
Okay.
We lost you 2 minutes ago, a minute ago.
Well, we could reschedule because I have some more information I'd like to put in there. So anybody have any questions you could put in the chat? I was almost done, so.
Why don't you just finish?
Yeah, finish it.
Okay, let me just do something real quick because there's someone that had wanted something specific. So let me see if I can share my screen again real quick. Oops. Everyone okay? Everyone can see everything?
Yes.
Okay. There's the catacombs in Matanzas.
Oh, wow.
There's one of my records at the cemetery. This man, I was intrigued by his last name. I Googled him and I found a whole business directory, an American business directory for Americans doing business in Matanzas. And you can see him listed there about halfway down on the right-hand side. He was a pharmacist with a really unusual last name. So, okay, are we done? No, I still need to get back to the cemetery to finish that, photograph the underground. And then we'd like to do a map like this, but after listening to Rich's presentation, one of those archives might have a map similar to this for Matanzas. As you can see, we can go in and put more GPS information to help people locate their ancestors.
Brian, I have a question. Given that there were 2 previous cemeteries, what happens to those previous bodies, tombstones, and what happens to, I mean, in Havana, it was just kind of pummeled over, but like in Matanzas, would there, or if anyone knows, would there exist any records of these previous cemeteries, of these older cemeteries that no longer function?
We'd have to check with those parishes that were in charge of those cemeteries.
Okay.
The parishes. Sometimes the cemeteries bulldozed over. Sometimes they take all the remains out and put them in one big grave. So in Colón Cemetery, there is an Espada monument, and I think there are some remains put in there. I have seen some families that take the remains out of the cemetery that's going to be demolished, and they put them into the next cemetery. I don't know where they put the remains, but I've seen tombs for people in Cologne, for example, that were originally in Espada. So there is some crossover. I don't know where those bodies are being kept until they get moved to their final resting place.
Brian, I have a question.
Yes.
Since you mentioned that some bodies have been moved because the cemeteries were being bulldozed or whatever, it's good to know that the bodies are moved somewhere. But I guess more important for us as genealogists, the records. Did they move somewhere when they moved the bodies?
I don't know if they always go to the archive office to let them know what they're doing, because my ancestor was moved from one grave to the Oddfellows grave without the cemetery knowing. So some of these cemeteries are big, you can get away with some of the things like that. So that's a good question.
Ryan. And I think that would depend on the area. I know that in Saguala Grande, for example, there was what they call the old cemetery from the middle to late 1800s, that as the town developed, what they did was that they built over it.
Yep.
And so the book cannot be found. Some of the theories are that the book is somewhere in the historical archive for the city, but not anywhere that anyone can locate it. I even talked to the local historian. And so I think that will depend on the area, whether or not it was directly connected to the church, a lot of other factors.
But that's a great point you bring up. Perhaps it is sitting in the local museum, or it doesn't hurt to ask, for sure.
Yeah, we need to document that. We need to start making lists so people know where we have looked, where we need to look. That's
However,
awesome.
the death records would still be found in the parish, so that
Correct.
stays the same.
Okay. This is one of the books that I found really interesting, where I found all the information about the church in Cuba, and they compare it with Puerto Rico. It's by a professor. He's I've emailed him. He's a professor at University in Orlando. Somebody had asked me about this gentleman, Jose Mariano Hernandez. He's interesting because he was born in Spanish Florida. Spain no longer owned Spanish Florida. He was also part of the American Congress. He was the first Hispanic elected to the American Congress, and wound up dying in Cuba, and I think in Matanzas Cemetery. So he was kind of born Spanish, worked American, and died Cuban. Like he's got a lot going on. So that's Jose Mariano, what does it say? Hernandez. So I do have more information on that. And if anybody has any ideas for future topics that Rich and I can cover, history of marriage in Cuba, which is super interesting. It's not as simple as easy as I thought it was. The suffragist movement, which tried to protect the illegitimate children. I'd like to do notable Cubans in 60 seconds. Our YouTube channel is coming soon with the video from last week. And then, of course, there's the Cuban Genealogy podcast. So sorry that was kind of rushed, but if anybody has any questions, probably getting tired of.
So are we putting the video, are we putting it on the Facebook page as well? Or can we,
it's super long, so I have to check to see if it's either. I was going to break it down in 2 parts and at least post the YouTube link on the on the Facebook page.
I have a question about, you said we can make requests on Find a Grave, and I'm not seeing a lot of cemeteries listed on Find a Grave for the Matanzas area. So how do we, like request a cemetery in that area through that program?
So you can also add a cemetery. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can email me and I can find the GPS coordinates for the cemetery. For example, I found a cemetery in Playa Larga that was just in between the roads, and it had the tombstones there with about 10 people. I took pictures of it. I just have to go to that GPS coordinate and put those people there. So if there's a cemetery you're looking for that's not on Find a Grave, we could certainly add it.
Okay, great, thank you.
Brian, have you heard of Billion's Grave?
Yeah, so Billion Graves, they told me, since I don't have the GPS coordinates, that this information would appear at the bottom of the page. It's not primary data source for them. So I kind of gave up on them.
Because they do have a, I don't remember right, don't quote me on this, but they do have where you can do a search by cemeteries and upload by cemeteries, I believe. So when you use their app to a cemetery, it automatically gets the GPS.
Correct.
So that's how you can upload it.
Right. That's why I avoided Billion Graves, because I don't use the GPS, my phone, when I'm in Cuba.
Okay.
You know, I take 2,000 to 4,000 pictures in like 2 days. So I was using a camera. When my phone dies, I'd use my camera. It doesn't record the GPS. So
Gotcha.
Billion Graves is GPS based.
Okay.
So they told me, since I don't have the GPS information for Cuban cemeteries, that information would appear at the bottom of their page.
Okay.
So to me, as a secondary data. So I want this to be primary data.
Okay. All right. I understand.
So,
okay. All right. I'll go search then on Find the Grave, because there seems to be a lot of families somewhere in there.
You know, I mean, in the genealogy world, Cuba is not loved. You know, I've talked to Find a Grave, I've talked to Billion Graves, I've gone to Roots Tech, I've gone to the DC genealogy. Like, there's not a lot of resources for us, and that's what was frustrating. And that's why we wanted to make sure we tried getting this information and getting it posted online as quickly as possible. I've gone to a cemetery, and 2 years later, I can't find that same gravestone. So that's why there's this urgency that we need to document it as soon as possible, because it doesn't last forever.
Well, like I told you last week, and Rich, I would love to come with you to help you guys in Cuba, but being Cuban born, it's kind of hard for me to get the passports and all that stuff. So,
Yep,
but I'll do everything on the state side. How's that?
I love it. We have our list of volunteers, and we'll be reaching out to all of you that have volunteered within the next week. So
sounds great. Sounds great.
We appreciate all of you. So
yeah, thank you so much for volunteering, for donating, whatever, for supporting, for just being on the call. It helps to have this community.
And by the way, regarding donations, I did click on the donation. Don't ask me how I got it, but where did I find it? But I did a monthly thing.
Wow, thank you.
There's a monthly comment. So if somebody was asking about it, where to go for it. So if you don't have a lot of money to give now, you can do a monthly thing, put it into your budget. So it's something that's available.
Thank you so much.
And just to reiterate, like I was saying a little earlier, Brian, when you were off, you know, we're digitizing these parishes. Don't have permission yet to publicize them, but I'm going to see if perhaps we can get permission to at least publish indexes sooner rather than later. So at least we have something that we can share, and then we'll work on trying to find a way that, you know, to get permission to publish the actual books. But perhaps we can have the indexes, but our digitization continues. Done about 4 parishes already. There's, you know, I have a list of quite a few more than I have the resources to go and do it. So we continue to push forward, and you know, hopefully we'll be able to share that parish information with you sooner rather than later.
Hey, Rick.
And this message is for me at least. While I was listening to the presentation, I kind of Googled on my iPad Amazon, or the book that you showed me. Amazon has a copy for like $50. So if anybody goes to Cuba and finds it and it's reasonably priced, I'll be willing to buy one, but I don't think I want to spend $50 on it.
I don't blame you.
But it sounds like an interesting book, so we'll keep it in the back of the mind.
Sandra, you were saying?
Yeah. Huh? So have you worked with Bejucal in the digitalization process or no?
Bejucal is, yes, it's really high on our priority list. We have Eileen Vega, who is on our board, and we are it's a question of getting there, and right now all of that is very up in the air. I have August as a target date, but I'm not buying my ticket just yet.
No, I got you, man. Yeah,
Bejucal is going to be fairly easy to do.
We were going to England a week ago, and we're still here.
Yeah,
we had to cancel a trip because of everything. Yeah, because I've been there quite a few times, and they're unfortunately, I think the first book, baptismal book, it's gone, like it's destroyed. I looked at it, and it's it's bad. It's very sad. But their first death book, I was able to carefully find one of my ancestors there, but it might still be salvageable. Like you might still be able to extract information, but it has to be done with it's in very poor condition.
Yeah.
It's only loose pages right now. And the second book of baptism, I think half of it is like gone, but the other half is still, you might be able to get information. So
And these books can also be, just another side note, it's possible that they can be restored here. I have a relationship with the University of Miami. I go to do a PhD at FIU. They have actual labs where they can repair and have offered to repair some of these books. So it's just a question of when a lot of the priests come to Miami actually. So there's hope, is what I'm saying, that some of these can be repaired.
the last time I went there, which was last August, the one from Bejucal, I believe he was the priest from Santiago, was service in Bejucal. So I don't know if it has changed or not, from Santiago de la Vega.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Tapaste was in very poor, the first one was it was very, very poor condition, but we were able to digitize it.
Oh,
Just
wow,
very,
that's awesome.
very carefully, but it's done, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Tapaste indexes that I worked on,
the
index, I can't remember the time frame, but the index only had the first name and one last name. So when I went in, I added the second last name. But in one record, there's about 6 other records. You've got the parents, the grandparents, and the godparents. And we need, I want those to be in the index as well, because maybe my ancestors in there. But in 1,200 baptisms, you have to multiply that by about 8. There's about 8 to 10,000 data points in there, but it's just so, it's overwhelming, but it's so amazing that we have the opportunity to look at these books.
Yeah, someone else, another volunteer, Samuel Martinez, is helping to transcribe the actual books, some of the very first books from Guanabacoa. So it's great because a lot of those are also falling apart. So there's a lot of work that we're currently doing to,
Yeah, I communicate with Samuel a lot because me and him share a lot of branches together. So he's on the Basayo line and all that.
Yes.
So yeah, it's amazing how many lines we share. I was surprised, but what I've seen, the Matanzas book, I don't know who was the first who did the indexes. They put the name of the parents, or at least in the first and second book online, so that could be useful in terms of putting stuff on the indexes. But I don't know.
Yeah, the indexes, Cuban Genealogy Club transcribed them, and it's just a question of what format you want to use. For some of the indexes, the original copies, it'll list the parents' names, and some of them do not. So then you have to go into the book, if you have access to the book, and go page by page to put the parents' names.
You're correct about that.
Yeah, but some of the indexes do show, for certain books will show the parents, and then certain other books, other books will not show the parents' names.
Yeah. Do you know what happened to the third book? Because I went to a cathedral last year.
Gone.
Like, I don't know why.
It's gone. I think it's been gone for 100 years, actually. The indexes aren't even of it. They don't have indexes for it. So yeah, I think it's just gone.
Rich, hopefully next time you can get another ladder and just get up there and find something else that's been lost for the last 40 years.
Books, yeah,
like you've done in the past.
I know. I found one of the lost books in Matanzas, the 6th book of deaths. So sometimes, they'll tell you it's not there, and it's there. They just have to look for it. And they're, a lot of the people that work there, it's not necessarily their thing. So they may not, go above and beyond to try to locate.
Oh, I know. I've been at it since 2006, so I'm quite familiar.
$5 or $10 goes a long way towards having folks want to help you.
Oh,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you so
Absolutely.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah, but even that, I've had it like it has to be somebody who's like my cousin with Guinness, for example. I've been trying to get records from Guinness for many, many years, and I would go when I would go to Cuba once every 2 years, and I would pay and make a donation and prepay them and get maybe 1 out of 10. And then I had to get my cousin to go there in person and do the stuff and push it to be able to get the stuff, or myself in person. Because when it's another person, like they won't look for siblings, they won't do all this stuff, or they won't be. And I understand, you know, they're not required to. They won't be careful. Like
Well,
if
they're
they
not
see something where,
required, and there are no indexes for deaths in Guinness.
yeah, exactly.
They don't have indexes for deaths. And in some cases, because that was one of the archives I was just at in January, they don't have the books are just, they're kept, you know, they're hidden. I mean, I found books stuffed underneath the escaparate that was probably there for 20 years. So they don't even know that the book is there. And in the case of the deaths, they're not indexed. So when they're not indexed, they're not going to look through the book. And not just Guinness, a lot of the parishes do not have indexes. So it makes it very challenging for them to find it.
Yeah, I was lucky at first. I haven't gotten lucky again that the lady who was guarding the parish in Catalina was related to me, and that she talked to the deacon, and I was able to get in there, and I pretty much at once, I think I got so many records, and I was able to go so far back, but now she passed away, unfortunately, and this last time I was trying to find a record there, and it took a while. So there are some parishes are like Bejucal is very has been very mainstream, where it's like they have air conditioning, which is good. They have transcribed some of the books with some information already, but other parishes, yeah, they can be very challenging to try to look through them.
That's why they need this project. We need need everything indexed. It needs to be in a spreadsheet. It needs to be searchable. It needs to be on a laptop. So it's in the church's best interest as well as the genealogists. Like, we want to help the churches.
Of course, that's the information that will be forever lost once it's lost. So
yeah, once the book disintegrates, forget it. It's gone. So it's got to be done.
No, and Rich knows not all the paper is made the same. Some of the paper is much lower quality and it deteriorates faster. And
yeah, some of the older books are in better shape than some of the books from the late 1800s. You know, it depends on the paper that they used, and a lot of the times the page literally has just fallen apart. So
yeah.
Oh well.
Any other questions?
Thank you for doing this. It's a fantastic project.
Thank you. Thank you, Julio.
Rick.
Yes, I have a question.
Thank you so much, guys.
Bye.
Okay, you can add me to your list for volunteers.
Thank you, Ulysses.
I will appreciate that.
And
wait
my
for the
question
next
is,
one,
when's the
guys.
next one? When's the next one?
And thank you for the presentation. Very good.
Oh, you're welcome. We'll probably do one in another couple of weeks.
Yeah, after Cuban Gen Club. Right?
Perfect. This is absolutely fabulous. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Yeah, really fantastic. Thank you.
Follow us on Facebook and we'll keep you updated. So we love it.
Yeah. All right, guys. Thank you for once again a great presentation. Can't wait for the next one. And